kids of Key West, Florida, there was nothing scarier than a monster matinee.
Lawrence Wolfe, the master of movie horror, exterminates you with Matt.
The story of Matt is based on scientific fact, on theories that have appeared in national magazines.
But in the fall of 1962,
a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on the island of Cuba.
They got the biggest scare of all.
They're gonna bomb us?
The country is on red alert.
And what a perfect time to open a new horror movie.
That'd be the best show to take a girl to.
The whole world's gonna blow up anyway, so we should just do whatever we want.
You know, last guy she went out with in reform school?
He did teach me a lot.
What about?
About my body.
Think if the bomb were about to fall, she'd do it with me?
Wait till you see the feelers on this thing.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Some of it's stage lighting, some of it's magic show stuff. But the big studios, none of them have anything like it. You never, ever turn one above 6.
This is it!
from Joe Dante, director of Gremlins.
You see what he's putting back? The showmanship.
The bombs are falling!
You think this is some kind of picnic for me?
I'm still concerned about that bomb thing.
Little question of taste?
No, but your younger patrons, you could have some seat wetness.
John Goodman.
I love this business.
Matinee.
Man, I've seen this twice.
Chama people, and welcome to our 160th episode of Gold Standard, the Oscars movie podcast, where we travel through time, reviewing the films that earn their gold statue, or standard, if you will, and beyond. I am one of your co-hosts, DJ Nick. And as always, joining me at the Gold Standard Theatre is one of my two podcasting partners in crime, the Ghostwood girl, Zan Sprouse. Hey, Zan, how are you today?
I am doing pretty well. Everything is pretty normal here. I don't have any worries about, missiles or Rumble Rama, nothing like that.
I am very glad to hear that. Sadly, we are down a professional nerd, as Rachel Friend will not be joining us today, folks, but do not fret, she will return. But until then, making his return to the podcast and bringing his film selection to the Gold Standard Theatre is the ever wonderful Mr. Sean Collins. Hey, Sean, how are you? And welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. I love to be here. And man, if I was any happier, I'd be twins.
Very nice indeed. So, of course, dear listeners, today we are reviewing Sean's selection, Matinee. This was directed by Joe Dante. The screenplay was by Charles S. Haas, who co-wrote the story with Jericho Stone, while the score was by a certain Jerry Goldsmith. An estimate for today's money, adjusted for inflation, this movie cost $30 million to make and made $22 million globally at the box office. It was released to the general public as of January the 29th of 93 and has a runtime of roughly 1 hour and 39 minutes. So, Sean, as you are our guest today and as you are the bringer of today's movie, what are your general impressions on Matinee and what made you pick this particular movie?
Well, Matinee in general, it's just a nearly perfect movie. It is a bright little ray of sunshine in an otherwise dark and cloudy world. And I find myself coming back to it fairly regularly because of that. John Goodman is, just a delight, as is the supporting cast. Joe Dante just seems like he had a lot of fun with this. And despite the fact that it was not, monetarily successful, certainly not as much as they would have liked, I strongly feel that it's kind of a hidden classic. It's one of those cult classics that not everybody knows about, and so I'm always championing films that I can bring to other people and go, dude, you haven't seen that yet, and get them to watch it. Most particular with this one, yes, we can talk about the 50s kitsch kookiness of Mant. Yes, we can talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the pressures that are going on and the coming of age story that kind of runs through the backdrop, and all these things are wonderful, and I will not diminish any of them. But the heart and soul of this film is John Goodman, and I'll go into his character more when we get to that segment. But one of the things that I very much appreciate about this film and his character is its understanding of the medium. I love movies about movies, but I love movies about movies that understand and enjoy and get that there is something magical about the movies that maybe you can't quite explain. And another one that kind of falls into that category for me is The Majestic with Jim Carrey. There's a great spiel in there about, the power of a movie house. And Goodman has not one, but two monologues in this. When he's setting everything up, and when you sell him the popcorn, you give him the jujubes, and you're all part of the magic. And these people are ready to go to war for him. They're just, agog at how important their job is. But the other one is when he's talking to Gene and kind of walking him through that it doesn't matter and that people kind of want to be scared or this, and they walk in and this is the land of opportunity. What have you got for me today? And then we give it to them, and then they go back outside and, oh, everything's going to be okay, regardless of what happens behind closed doors. It's just a movie that, while I don't think it takes itself too seriously, it lives on the nice edge of very tongue-in-cheek, very fantasy almost, with its approach to things, very simplistic way of looking at the world, but it's got that earnestness to it that prevents it from tipping too far into corny. And that's just, it's a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. And it's just one of those films that I come back to, and every single time I watch it, I just have a warm fuzzy. And so I thought, you know what I need? I need this right now. The world kind of sucks. It's a bit of a dumpster fire, and if I'm going to go on this podcast and be all serious and talk film analysis, I want to talk about something warm and fuzzy. So that's it.
And that brilliantly described for sure. And I will personally say this was the first time I sat down to watch this. I'm actually very grateful to you for bringing this to the Gold Standard Theatre. One of the great things about having, returning guest co-hosts and guest co-hosts for that matter, is that we get to explore all the corners of the cinematic universe, which is a wonderful thing. And Zan, moving this over to you, I know you're a big fan of this one. So what are your thoughts on general thoughts on Matinee?
I am. I love this movie. I love it for all of the reasons Sean already mentioned. I think in general, Joe Dante is an underrated director. And I think this movie is a perfect example of how well he makes movies and how obvious it is that he loves movies and what good work that he can do. And watching this again, I was wondering why it didn't do well at the time. It was 1993. I remember it being out for about 5 minutes in the theaters. And I'll talk more about this when we talk more about Gene. I feel like I very much related to Gene at the time, and I was probably near his age when this movie came. I was a little older, but I loved monster movies. And MST3K was very popular, and so it seemed like it should have tapped into that, classic cinema, and the, all of the whole. We'll talk more about this when we talk about Lawrence Wolseley's character, the whole showmanship of the William Castle era. And with my generation growing up with Gremlins, you would think that they would want to see more Joe Dante movies, but I don't know why that never really translated like that. I think that this movie got marketed improperly the same way Hugo got marketed improperly. I feel like they are similar movies in the sense that they are a story that is around a love of cinema and a love of an era of cinema. And when you looked at the advertising material for Hugo, it looked like a kid and trains. And with Matinee, I think because of the time period, they were trying to play up the more Wonder Years aspect of it than they were it was, there's a movie coming out and the kids are interested, but it was more about the kids. And the kids are an interesting story. And it's also a movie that doesn't talk down to kids when they are in an incredibly stressful situation. And they are in incredibly stressful situations. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis hanging over everything, but then we also have everything from a girl experiencing her first abusive relationship to a little brother who is trapped on the balcony. There's very stressful things going on for these kids, and this movie does not talk down to them and does not talk down to how much kids take on when there is times of stress. And I'm not trying to downplay that aspect of this movie, because I feel like even though we have had all kinds of coming of age stories before, this one is a little bit different because we don't really do the Cuban Missile Crisis. You don't see that as much, and even then, you don't see it in the Keys that close to Cuba. We have movies like Stand By Me and Dirty Dancing and all of the sort of coming of age movies that we had in the 80s, where some of them are stressful and some of them are just kind of goofy, but this one was a little bit different anyway. And it had the aspect of being a military brat, and there were just so many things about it that I think could have really hooked people to relate to some characters. But for whatever reason, I don't think it was marketed properly, because it's really a very well done movie. I really can't talk about how good this movie is without talking about how Mant is one of the most wonderful movie parodies in the history of cinema. Mant has music cues that are straight out of movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon and This Island Earth, even where Kathy Moriarty says, "I'd be afraid, Bill. I'd be very afraid," comes right from Cronenberg's The Fly. Bill makes the screechy noises like the ants make in Them. And just even having Kevin McCarthy and William Shallert in Mant in the first place is such a wonderful love letter to that era of 50s and 60s atomic creature features. And so there's just so much love that goes into this movie for cinema, for showmanship, for different kinds of cinema. You don't usually see love letters to William Castle and some of the cheesier aspects of cinema. And then just even an appreciation of nostalgia, and how even with nostalgia, youth is not that innocent, because the world still goes on around you when you're young. And there's just so much reverence and love for everything that's in this movie. And it is such a sweet story. We have a very obvious villain who gets what's coming to him in the end. And then we have the wonderful resolution of the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it really is very warm and fuzzy. And it is one that I recommend a lot, because it's just, like I said, I think it's extremely underrated. I think it's extremely underplayed even. It's not one of those that failed at the box office, but then played on cable a bazillion times. It just kind of faded away into home video. And so anytime I get a chance to recommend it or sing its praises, I'm happy to take it.
I think we're going to be singing quite a few praises today when it comes to this movie, Zam, for sure. And, to piggyback on what both of you just said, I definitely agree. This film very much, and this was the first time I sat down to watch it, it does feel like a love letter to the strange magic of going to the movies. Not simply because it celebrates old monster films and theatrical gimmicks, but because it understands, like you guys were saying, that cinema has always been a place where people willingly suspend disbelief together. It isn't interested in mocking that experience. Instead, it embraces it with warmth and curiosity and just enough irony to keep it grounded. What struck me the most is how effortlessly it balances nostalgia with self-awareness, because it recognizes that the fears and fascinations of an era can become entertainment, and that entertainment in turn can help people process genuine anxiety. The backdrop of looming catastrophe is never treated as mere decoration. It is woven into the story as a reminder that escapism isn't always about denial. Sometimes it's a way of confronting uncertainty from a safe distance, wrapped in spectacle and laughter. There is also, I think, a quiet affection for the rituals of movie-going itself. The anticipation before the lights dim, the collective gasps, the laughter, the applause, the feeling that for a couple of hours, strangers become an audience with a shared emotional rhythm. And I think the film suggests that these moments are just as important as whatever is happening on the screen. What I appreciated the most is the movie's generosity, because it refuses to sneer at low-budget horror, sensational marketing, or audiences eager to be thrilled. Instead, it sees value in all of it. Imagination is treated as something noble rather than childish. An illusion becomes a craft worthy of admiration, not because it's real, but because it creates genuine emotions. So ultimately, Matinee left me with the sense that cinema is a peculiar kind of time machine. It preserves not only old stories, but the hopes, the fears, the fashions, and dreams of the people who once gathered in dark theaters to watch them. And I think it reminds us that even the silliest creature feature can carry a surprising amount of humanity beneath the rubber suits and painted backdrops. And I think that's why this movie has endured, because it understands that movies are never just about what's projected onto the screen. They're about the people watching the era they inhabit and the fleeting moment when fiction feels just real enough to matter. So I absolutely loved this film. And once again, I'm so glad that Sean brought it to my attention, because, of course, Zan was already familiar with this one. So cheers for this one, Sean. So let's get to our characters on the board, starting with our Hollywood producer and his girlfriend. We have, of course, the aforementioned John Goodman as Lawrence Wolsey and Kathy Moriarty as Ruth Corday. So, Zan, starting with you, what did you make of Lawrence and Kathy? Or Ruth, rather.
Yes, these two are perfect. And I think John Goodman, thanks to being on a long-running sitcom and thanks to his roles in Coen Brothers movies, I think he definitely gets some recognition that he deserves. He's in my all-time favorite movie called True Stories, which is also another movie that doesn't get seen a lot. So he can do anything. He can be quirky, he can be a villain, he can be anything, he can be hilarious. Kathy Moriarty, on the other hand, I think she is wildly underrated. She's always wonderful in whatever she's in, and she seems to be in a lot of movies that I think are underrated, like this one, But I'm a Cheerleader, Soap Dish. Those are all very underrated comedies that she's just brilliant in. And I feel like she is almost a second generation Mary Warnoff, because she can be a love interest, but she can also be very harsh and very badass. So they sort of remind me of each other a little bit. And even these two characters would sort of put me in mind of an old Amazing Stories episode where Mary Warnoff and her longtime collaborator Paul Bartel did something called The Secret Cinema, where they were they were producing this thing. So I think they just do both fantastic performances. I'll talk more about Ruth first, because I'm going to talk about Lawrence for a long time. I feel like she is such a perfect example of how, when you do make B movies, everybody wears several hats. She's stars in the movie, but she's the nurse at the movie theater, and she's helping build the props. This is not if you've seen Ed Wood, you can see that everybody picks up a hammer when they need to. But that doesn't mean she's still not every bit as, beautiful and glamorous as our favorite B movie stars always tried to be. She's still very Hollywood and still very, stands out in the small towns that she's in. And it's just fun watching her, and, the cynicism about what they're making, because they know that they're making not great movies, but they know they're making fantastic entertainment. And the support she gives to Lawrence, but also the crap she gives to Lawrence as well, because these are B movies, and we're making B movie money here. And unless you're making a lot of B movies, B movie money doesn't go terribly far a lot of the time. So, I love watching Kathy Moriarty also act as her character, but then act in Mant as well, because you can see her go from like good acting to pretend bad acting, which is always wonderful to watch. She's so perfect in that. And she just 100% understood the assignment, both Ruth and Kathy Moriarty. I think they both know what they were doing there and what their roles were. And I think that as much as I love a lot of those atomic age creature features, I love those. And we've talked about this before on this podcast, how in certain eras, certain movies, they try as hard as they could for their time period to be feminist. There's always, like, even in The Creature from the Black Lagoon, it's like she's also a scientist, but she's also going to get married to one of them, or she's a scientist, but her dad is too. Those little things. And so seeing her off screen and definitely being, this is his dream, and he's the motivation, I think, for the showmanship machine that is, Woolsey Pictures. A lot of the brains are her as well. And I think this movie does a good job of sort of quietly showing us some things just by showing us how things work with people. And she's definitely not just a screamer in these movies. She is incredibly necessary to this production of everything. And it's also a good example of, you just keep friends around you that you make believe in your dream with you, and you can do pretty much anything. And you see that with her, and also with the characters that Dick Miller and John Sayles play. They have a couple of buddies. One got blacklisted. He needs a job, so I send him ahead of time to the town, and then they protest. Which again is an adorable thing that is an aspect of Joe Dante movies. Joe Dante and John Sayles, John Sayles wrote The Howling, and he wrote Piranha. And so they've worked together before. Dick Miller is in every single Joe Dante feature film. At least he was up until he passed. I don't know what, that's so yeah, every movie that he ever did, Joe Dante wanted Dick Miller for because of knowing him from monster movies, which is amazing. And it's almost, when you sort of see the cast of this movie, you can sort of see Joe Dante a little bit in the Lawrence Woolsey character himself, even though Lawrence Woolsey is very obviously William Castle. William Castle from House on Haunted Hill, 13 Ghosts. 13 Ghosts, by the way, which features Margaret Hamilton from The Wizard of Oz. And when he talks about a ghost coming out over the audience, that's what they're referencing at the very end of the movie. That's what they're referencing. He's very, he looks like William Castle. He smokes a cigar like William Castle. He's very obviously William Castle. But I think Joe Dante does work to make this character unique and more reminiscent of William Castle than anything else. And I think put a little bit of himself in it. John Goodman, again, talk about understanding the assignment. I think everybody who was in this movie probably had an affinity for these B movie pictures, because first of all, a lot of them made those B movie pictures. And but yeah, he absolutely understands what he's doing here. And again, he's going to town with his fancy car, and he's all dressed up and really boastfully talking about his amazing new production. And based on scientific fact, published in national magazines. I love that, where he just quickly moves magazines across the screen. He's such an amazing showman, this character. But again, he's also the one rolling his sleeves up. He's installing everything. He's going to these towns for these premieres because he's installing the stuff. He owns it all. He's gonna disassemble it and take it to the next theater. This is a grassroots campaign for these movies with this guy. And John Goodman he's so good, and I love him so much that I love how much he believes in what he's doing. He believes in these bad movies. And again, there are a lot of things in this movie I relate to, that these bad movies are bringing an entire town together. These movies sell out. This was for as crazy as it was, this was these kids' first date. This movie got somebody, Starkweather. I love that his name is Starkweather, by the way. This movie showed the whole town and Sherry what Starkweather really was like, and he goes to jail. Like, this movie, because he goes crazy working for Woolsey and turns up the equipment too loud and tries to kidnap somebody while in a mant suit. he's going to go to jail. Like everything that, all of the great outcomes, and then Sherry and Stan get to be together. Like all of the great outcomes from this movie come from what happens in this theater. I mean, of course, aside from the Cuban Missile Crisis ending, but everyone has this great time. And you even have this wonderful political discussion between, the parents. It's like, yeah, this movie is terrible, but they can't tell us what to not watch. You have those, everybody's sort of talking, everybody's coming together for these bad movies. And he knows that. And he knows that what he's not putting into the picture itself in acting and set design and script writing, he's going to make up for in Rumble Rama and Tomo Vision and everything else that he's doing. And William Castle also did The Tingler, and all that kind of true showmanship in theaters. But also at the same time, the way he relates to Gene. And when I was saying before about how this movie does not talk down to its kids, about how he's extremely honest with Gene and he's on the level with him. When Gene was like, hey, so that guy that was protesting, he was in one of your movies. He's like, oh, you must see a lot of monster movies, kid. Don't you have any friends? Well, whatever. And he basically is just giving him these honest pieces of advice and leveling with this kid and understanding that just because he's figured out that this is an actor in the movie doesn't mean he's not going to love his monster movies anymore. He's, where he thinks the kid's bribing him for free tickets. He's like, what do you want? I want to help. Okay, come on in. Roll up your sleeves. We got some work for you to do. That he's definitely, for as boastful as Woolsey is, he's definitely not a diva. He's gonna he comes in and he hires local people to work, and he's gonna help this kid out with his, this kid Gene kind of needs to talk to a dad figure, and Woolsey kind of becomes that for a little bit for Gene. Even, at the end saying, was that your first date? It's going to be hard to top, but you kids will do it. Just so he's very encouraging, and he's, even though you can see that he is constantly coming up with ideas and trying to figure out how to fund his next movie. This town isn't just a town of numbers for him. I mean, these mean something, which is, why he's there trying to help everybody get out of the theater and everything. So he's a good guy, even though he just sort of seems like he could be any other stereotypical bad movie producer, and I think again, that might come from Joe Dante's experience and, an affinity for somebody like Roger Corman, who, again, not as showmanshipy, but definitely some B movies under his belt. This John Goodman did such a fantastic job in this of being this larger than life, small potatoes movie producer director, and just an all around better guy than you would expect him to be based on, oh, this guy's coming from Hollywood. He comes in and he's working at the theater for like 3 days beforehand with his sleeves rolled up, putting together, cardboard displays and Rumble Rama under the seats. And you figure out that's why the big car is there, for the big trunk to put all the Rumble Rama stuff in. So yeah, these are great characters. They are great nods to this part of Hollywood. This sort of B movie creature feature Saturday afternoon, kid, the kids went, but in order to scare themselves, and the older kids went in order to remember the days of when they scared themselves, and then the adults kind of maybe went to get stoned to watch monster movies. That era of Hollywood is one of my favorites, and so I think they both did a fantastic job of representing that part of Hollywood.
They 100% did. I totally agree with you. And if I ever meet John in person, I'm definitely going to give the man a big old hug, because I adore him as well. And Sean, what did you make of our director and, of course, the lady who wears many hats?
Well, everything that Zan said times 1,000. You just nail it. Firstly, I'm very, very happy, Nick, that you liked this. I'm over here fist pumping when you're saying how much you enjoyed it, because that means a lot to me. That again, when you work in a video store and people, hey, what do you got that's good? And you pull something like this off the shelf and you go, just trust me, try it. And then they come back and go, yeah, that was really good. That's a, yeah, okay. That makes all the early mornings and late nights and arguing over late fees and just, that makes it all worthwhile. So I'm glad you liked it. It's interesting that Zan brought up Ed Wood, because watching this and seeing the dynamic that Woolsey and Ruth have, I was very much struck with Ed Wood, which I just watched for the first time a couple of years back. And it inspired me to watch Plan 9 from Outer Space, which I'd never seen. Because, you know, it's got this infamy about it. Worst film ever made and blah, blah, blah. And so watching Ed Wood and Johnny Depp's very earnest, I thought, performance in it, and then watching Plan 9 and being a filmmaker and knowing what small budgets and time crunches and all of those things that you face. And I will say this, I'll go out on, I'm going to put this on record. I don't think Plan 9 is as bad as everybody makes it out to be. I think, yes, it's got some hiccups and some problems. Definitely could have done with a better editor, but you know, the earnestness is there. The attempt to be entertaining was there. And I'll go so far as to say that I think that if Ed Wood had gotten a legit producer that could pump a little bit of money into these things, that he would be a director of a much different renown. And when you watch Matinee, I think in many ways, Ruth is Woolsey's Lugosi, that she's going to come along and she's going to be in the picture. But she's also, I mean, she's the face. She's the actress, the one that Hollywood would know. And, oh, we've got this blonde bombshell and everything. So he's kind of using that in a certain degree to his advantage. But she's also willing to go to the fundraisers and help out with the sets and go to the, you know, things. But she also keeps him grounded while he is off, you know, dreaming up the next big thing, Alaman, Manigator, Galligator, and he gets real excited. and she's kind of there to rein him in a little bit, and not necessarily rain on his parade, but just to gently remind him, great, that will cost money. We need to think about how we're going to come up with it. And in another beautiful tie-in to the very meta nature of this movie, I don't think it's any surprise that Woolsey never has any money, because he spends it all on promotion. I mean, he's got a giant 50-foot ant leg coming off the, you know, both sides of the theater and all of the Rumble Rama stuff and the hitting up the town early and all that stuff. But it's very much like Hollywood. It's like, well, this film cost $20 million, but we spent $87 million marketing. And it feels very much like that's a comment on that from Joe Dante, who would be in a position to know these kinds of things. So Ruth is there to kind of toe that line between really supporting him and allowing him to do all this crazy stuff. And in many ways, it wouldn't surprise me at all to find that she had a producer's credit on every film, because, you know, she's doing the producer's job. She's keeping him honest. And I love Kathy Moriarty. She has such a great talent for this type of character. And you see it a lot. You see it in Casper and you know, Soap Dish and all of these films that Zan mentioned, where she's kind of the glamorous bitchy, you know, and not self-serving necessarily, but yeah, what's in it for me? Because A, B, C, D, E, X, you know, you've got to look out for these things. And she's just so wonderful and such a far cry in a way from the literal punching bag that she wound up in Raging Bull. And it was I just watched that recently and was like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot that Kathy Moriarty's in this, and so much time spent being put up on this pedestal only to be and now you're the wife and I don't care anymore. I don't understand guys or women that allow that to happen. It's just such a why, but that's another topic. So she is just radiant in everything she does, and she makes it look effortless. And as Ann said, when she's, quote unquote, bad acting within Matt and delivering the corniest bits of dialogue, Bill, you get down from there. And, just, and she buys into it. And, again, she understood the assignment. She gets it. She knows, we can turn the dial up to here and be right on that knife's edge without falling into the absurdity. And it's just wonderful. Woolsey is interesting because while he is very much in that William Castle, I think he knows he's a William Castle, but I think he's aiming to be a Hitchcock. I think the playing with the cigar and the silhouette and the turn and, my new picture and we're doing this and, the talking to the audience stuff. I think he would like to see himself of that stature. And if I have to, shill a few nickels and things to get there, then I'm okay with that. But he is also a dichotomy of parts, because as written, Woolsey could almost come across as the huckster, the shyster, the very elegant con man who's going to, sweep into town and set up a boys band and then escape with all of your money. But he's charming, so we're going to allow it. But he never falls into that despicable realm of con men because he cares too much. And part of that is the genius of casting John Goodman, because you say, oh, John Goodman's in it. And we go, aw, I like him. So there's an automatic check mark in the win column for the film at that point. Much like they did anytime they had Robin Williams play a villain. And so you had that, but I like him, but he's doing this. the subversion of expectations. But the other side of Woolsey is that for all of his grandiose, grandstanding, man behind the curtain, he believes in it. He believes in movies. He believes in what he's doing. He believes in the power of cinema, even bad cinema, that it can bring these people together. And the film is definitely laid out with all of these little, plot threads and these characters and what they've got going on over here, and they've got going on over here, and they've got going here. And all of these plots intersect at the theater. It all comes to a head there in the third act, with Woolsey kind of the baton-wielding conductor of it all. Zan talked about how he doesn't talk down to kids, and the movie doesn't either. But he doesn't talk down to anybody. We all know the theater owner's kind of a weasel. He's kind of just oh man, you're a doofus, and very aptly played by Robert Picardo, which is a kind of another of Joe Dante's stable of regulars. And even Gene points it out. He's a tool, and he says, "Well, I kind of liked him." But in all of his interactions, whether Woolsey's talking to Gene, or he's talking to the theater owner, or he's talking to the crowd outside, or he's talking to Ruth in private, it's the same conversation. It's the same level of, you come up here and we'll talk like adults. We're gonna, he doesn't necessarily let on that he's looking down on anybody, and I don't think that he does. Even Starkweather, he knows he's a goofy, dumb kid, and he says so later. I said, "Goofy kid, he turned up my stuff too high," but he believed in him enough to hire him. So, what does that say? The guy is just too even keeled. And it's that kind of earnestness that the character has that John Goodman taps into that, again, prevents it from going over the edge into the absurdity. and just keeps it right there in this is the zone. And I don't think any other actor could have pulled this off. I think if you'd gotten a Bill Murray, there would have been more winking and nudging, at the audience, and probably a little more mean-spirited jokes at some of the characters. If you'd have gotten, anybody, take your pick. I don't care who it is. There would have been a different movie made than what we got. And what we got is just perfection. It is so well done. But Woolsey is such a kind of a lovable scamp because of his earnestness, because he believes in it, because of the truth in his nature, that I would hop in the van and follow this guy to the next town and be installing Rumble-Ramas for the rest of my life, because he gets it, and I'm here for it. So
I 100% agree. I think the man is in the business for the right reasons. Very well said, Sean. And to piggyback off what you were just saying, I think Lawrence is one of those rare cinematic figures who could easily have been written as a con artist or an object of ridicule. Yet, like you were saying, the film treats him with remarkable affection because, of course, it does help. It is John Goodman. He is a showman, I think, in the purest sense, because he knows that fear can be entertaining, that audiences want to be amazed, and that presentation can be every bit as important as the film itself. And I think there's something almost old-fashioned about his philosophy. He isn't selling deception so much as an experience. He wants people to leave the theater with stories they'll tell for years, which I hope is what most filmmakers want to do. What I think makes him compelling is that beneath the flamboyant salesmanship, there's genuine integrity. He understands the line between playful illusions and exploitation, and when reality becomes more frightening than anything he could stage, and his priorities shift accordingly. That small moral core, I think, keeps him from becoming a caricature. He, I think, very much represents an era when filmmakers and exhibitors were part magician, part carnival barker, and part dream merchant. Whereas Ruth has the air of someone who's been in the business long enough to see through all of its illusions. If Lawrence is still energized by the magic of putting on a show, Ruth often feels as though she's already peeked behind the curtain 1,000 times. There's a dry wit and emotional distance to her that suggests she's become somewhat cynical about it, but not, in a negative way. She's become somewhat jaded by the routines of promotion and celebrity and low-budget filmmaking. What I think makes her interesting is that her cynicism is not bitter. It's seasoned. She knows that publicity is manufactured, that audiences can be manipulated, and that much of the glamour surrounding the industry is performance. She's very much practical where Woolsey is idealistic. He dreams up the next spectacle. She understands the mechanics that make the spectacle possible. And I think that contrast makes their partnership richer. Lawrence genuinely believes in the emotional power of showmanship. Ruth, meanwhile, often behaves like someone who has stopped believing in the fantasy itself, but still appreciates the craft behind it. She'll play her part because she's a professional, not because she's swept away by the illusion. And I also think there's a hint of melancholy in her characterization. You get the impression that she's lived through enough productions, enough publicity tours, and enough disappointments that she's learned to protect herself with a layer of irony. Yet that doesn't mean that she's heartless. Every now and then you can glimpse flashes of warmth beneath the world-weary exterior, and those moments are more affecting precisely because they're so understated. So I guess in a way, Ruth and Lawrence represent two different relationships with cinema itself. Lawrence is the eternal enthusiast, convinced that movies can still astonish people if presented with enough flair. Ruth is the veteran who knows every trick in the book and no longer mistakes illusion for reality. Yet I think she stays because despite her skepticism, she still recognizes that those tricks can matter to the people in the audience. And I think that balance is one of the film's quiet pleasures. It would have been easy to make Ruth either a starry-eyed believer or a completely cynical foil. Instead, I think she's somewhere in between. Intelligent, experienced, slightly weary, but never entirely disconnected from the peculiar magic that keeps the show going. And I think that complexity is one reason she remains memorable, despite not having a large amount of screen time. But is Kathy Moriarty, and we know that even if you give her 5 minutes, she will make the most with those 5 minutes. And I think these two just do such a great job together. So let's get to some of our teens. We have our two Loomis brothers and their mother. We have Simon Fenton as Jean, Jesse Lee as Dennis, and Lucinda Jenny as Anne Loomis. So, Sean, what did you make of the Loomis trio?
In some ways, they're a very stereotypical Army family, Air Force family, Navy family, whatever branch they happen to be in. Dad's off doing the thing, and they're holding down the fort. I was an Army brat growing up. Dad was in the service, and so there was a lot of, not necessarily at wartime, but there was a lot of him being away and just kind of having that desire for a father figure around the house who wasn't somebody that was there and gone. So I can totally understand what the boys are coming from. I also understand that very singular geek loneliness. For me, it was, obviously of a much older age with Star Wars and Star Trek and Doctor Who and science fiction, as opposed to the monster movies. But, sitting in your room with the entire floor covered with catalogs and comic books and magazines devoted to that particular subject. Yeah, been there. The way Jean has some difficulties relating to the fairer sex at school and really wanting to ask her out, but not quite getting there. Jean was far more adventurous and capable than I wound up being. But, I get it. And having a younger brother. My brother, Eric, is 6 years younger than I am. And so there was a lot of tagging along. And I don't want to say babysitting, but, where are you going? Take your brother with you. And I didn't know. We were apparently latchkey kids that, mom worked second shift. And so she wasn't home when we would get home from school, and we would let ourselves into the house, and we would ride our bikes all over the neighborhood. And it was as so many films, Goonies and things of that nature in the 80s portrayed, nobody kept an eye on these kids. You just went out and you did things, and you hung out down in the creek, and you rode your bike across the freeway, and, you went places and you did things. And as long as you got home before the street lights came on, you were fine. And so I was really shocked to learn that latchkey kid, meaning a kid who has a key to the front door, was a thing. I was like, I was 8 years old when I found out I was a latchkey kid. Who knew? This funny world that we live in. But the idea of them going out and spending the afternoon, or in some cases all day, at the theater, I can totally see that, and having to deal with I'm scared of the monsters, and nah, you're not, come on. And then, oh yeah, they're really scared of the monsters. It's a very close to home presentation of this family. And it's not played for laughs. It could be. It's not played for sappy sentimentality, though it could be. It once again strikes just the right balance of, we're here, here's the setup, here's the relationship, and you're off and running, because their story arc's going to take them in a different direction than what, the movie's not about that. The movie's about this and how it affects them. And it's a nice little couple of characters we've got here. Mom doesn't really get a whole lot of screen time, but did we lose you, Nick?
I'm back. It's all good.
I'm back. Okay. Wanted to make sure I wasn't prattling on to nobody, which frequently happens.
No, it's all good.
As Dr. Ian Malcolm would say, here I am now talking to myself. But it's a beautiful little, the essence of chaos. But it's a beautiful little family dynamic that they have. And while Mom doesn't get a lot of screen time, I don't think that she needs it. I think that her kind of singular role is to watch the TV, be worried about dad, and not be worried about what the kids are getting up to until it's time to be worried about what the kids are getting up to. And so that's what we get from them.
I definitely think so, for sure, and it's a beautiful little family indeed. And Zan, what did you make of the Loomis trio?
Yeah, this is a very close-knit, kind family to each other, and I like seeing that because you could play it a lot of ways, and at the time we weren't seeing nice families as much. I mentioned John Goodman being on Roseanne. That was kind of a dysfunctional family. So seeing one that is functioning within the dysfunction of the world was very nice, because you have their mother, Anne, who is trying to raise these boys essentially by herself, when they're so close to where their dad is, but he's on the ship. He's so far. And it's not easy for anyone to move around the way that military families move around. And, she's definitely the brave face of the family, because, no matter where they are, dad is at work. He has the job and the other people that he works with that he can go to, and his struggles are, we don't see those. Those are when he's at work. But we also, of course, have dad in the military during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 100 miles away from Cuba. So she does such a great job of showing how hard it is to try to be, a single parent, yet at the same time missing the husband that she knows could come home if everything goes well. The amount of fear that she has is not lost here, that we see how difficult that is for her. And then with Gene's little brother, and I love how Gene and his mom sort of try to come together to keep the little brother a little brother as long as possible, because the oldest child always grows up faster than all of the children that come after them. But that is so much more true for a military brat, because they've seen more moves, and they've seen more new schools, and they've seen more, just Gene is saying, what is the point? We moved to a town where everybody's known each other since preschool, and then as soon as you make a friend, you're gone again. Like, why even bother? Why even bother to learn their names? And you can see how his mother interacts with him about that, with, scolding him a little bit for taking the little brother to a scary movie, but also trying to be a mother to him, because she has two kids that are very different in age and have very different struggles for the type of life that the parents have chosen for this family. And you can see her struggling to do the best job she can for them. And you can see Gene sort of struggling to be the best brother he can by being as reassuring as he can be to his little brother, but still being the big brother sometimes. He's being the big brother and all that implies. The one who kind of plays tricks on his little brother, but also who is very protective of his little brother as well. And Gene as a character, I feel like I related to quite a bit in a different way. I was not military, but I was an only child who was extremely introverted. And a lot of the time when I wasn't good at making friends, or I wasn't good at initiating social things, movies were my friends. And just like Gene, when you get me started on something, I will talk your ear off about it. It's something I'm interested in. And, I was the kid with the encyclopedic knowledge. I still am that kid, but nobody needs me anymore. We have Google. We don't have to ask Zan. She'll know. That's not a thing as much as it used to be. But yeah, he's really into these monster movies. So when he, is hanging out with the kids at school and they start, he's like, that's a different guy. And it's this movie. And everybody's sort of like, wow, okay. A lot about movies. They're sort of weirded out by it, but they're also kind of impressed at the same time. A best case scenario for encyclopedic knowledge of your favorite stuff. And yeah, he's the movie does a good job of playing into the stereotype of how military kids are usually more mature than the other kids are, but in a way that isn't stale. I mean, you sort of see why Gene has other things on his mind than some of these other kids. he has had to change, he has had to move, he has had to put himself out there more. He has, he is the older brother, he has responsibilities, and he's privy to things that maybe other kids are not as invested in. The Cuban Missile Crisis might be this scary thing that you hear about on the news, but his dad is there. And so he's much closer to all of it. And so even when he's, trying to talk to girls and everything, and this is in the comment I'm about to make is in no way, shape, or form meant to say anything terrible about Sherry Kelly Martin's character, because Kelly Martin does a fantastic job in this as well. Jean, Sherry is like the cute girl with the perfect pink dress and the perfect 60s hair and everything like that. But Sandra's the one who's interested in the truth and what's really going on. And so he seems to have a little bit more substance to him as a person. I mean, we do learn later that Sherry is learning a lot about herself, and there is a lot more substance to her than what Stan originally knows about her. Just even from her being interested in Coral, she's not just the pretty girl at school, but just what he notices has a little more substance, I think, when he notices Sandra, and just the two of them and their very earnest and serious conversation about how they're the only people left in the world, and therefore they're going to have to repopulate it. So I guess we should start making out now. Like, there's just something so adorable about the two of them when they're in the bomb shelter, trying to be, the adults ahead of their time that they're thinking that the bombs have made them face, basically. But even when he is, talking to Woolsey and saying, "Hey, I noticed that the guy at the protest was this guy who's in your movies. What's up with that?" And Woolsey's like, "What do you want, kid?" Like, thinking he's gonna blackmail him or bribe him, but he's like, "No, I want to help. I want to be a part of this." And I think, like I said before, not only does Gene sort of need a father figure, which he kind of finds in Woolsey for a bit, he needs to be a part of something, because he never really has time to be a part of something. And honestly, this movie production is a perfect thing for him, because it's going to pick up and go away. He's going to be what's left behind when the movie is gone. So Gene's kind of good at things that aren't necessarily permanent. So he's found a perfect thing to be a part of. And I'm always interested in what his and Sandra's relationship is going to be like, because she has such sort of beatnik parents compared to his military family. I think that would be kind of adorable. But I think there's such a perfect blend of adolescence and maturity in Gene's character. I think Simon Fenton does a really wonderful job of that, because he's still a kid. He still likes girls in monster movies and likes to play tricks on his little brother and deserves to have his first kiss. And it's too bad it's under such crazy duress, but he should be having fun even with this literal possible cloud floating over him all the time. And while I think a lot of us as kids do have stressors that we deal with that are beyond our control, I mean, all of us have that. If our parents are fighting, or dad loses a job, or we have to move, or just anything, you can't eat lettuce, whatever is going on in the world, kids feel that. And it's not always such impending doom as, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the way these kids are written, I think, is a great way of showing that kids are dealing with this too. You see Gene's friends who are just kind of like dorks that are just regurgitating everything they hear at dinner or on the news or in magazines or something, whereas I think, Gene and the Sandra character are a little bit more thoughtful about it. And I like that about Gene's character, because, again, like I said, I feel like I related to that character quite a bit. Somebody who's, would spend time to themselves with introspection in monster movies. That was very much my adolescence.
I do think that if Gene were a real person, we would probably invite him on the podcast at some point. I mean, heck, we know, I guess Simon Fenton is around, so I guess we always ask him to.
100%.
bring back the Gene character, but he would totally be a great guest on Gold Standard for sure. But yeah, when it comes to these three, I agree. I think Gene is very much the film's emotional anchor because he is that observant teenager standing on the threshold between childhood and adulthood. And as usual, I always bring in the famous Britney song, I'm not a girl, not yet a woman. And who knows, someday we might be reviewing Crossroads. Who knows, folks? But I think going back, this Matinee unfolds largely through his perspective. And what I find most appealing about Gene is that he possesses a genuine sense of wonder without being naive, as you were saying, Zan, because he's fascinated by horror films and theatrical spectacle. Yet he also becomes increasingly aware of the very real anxieties surrounding him. And I think the film uses him to explore a beautiful idea, i.e., that imagination isn't an escape from reality, but one way of learning to live with it. And, he's also remarkably empathetic. He doesn't rush to judgment, and he's willing to see the good in people who might seem eccentric or larger than life. And I think that openness allows him to appreciate Lawrence's showmanship for what it really is, an art form built around giving people a memorable experience. Dennis, of course, the younger brother, I think brings this completely different energy to the story. He's full of enthusiasm and mischief and the boundless excitement that only a young child can have. And, while Gene is beginning to analyze the world around him, Dennis simply wants to enjoy it. His reactions to monsters and gimmicks and theatrical scares remind us, I think, of the uncomplicated joy that movies can inspire before adulthood introduces skepticism. And I do think Dennis serves an important thematic purpose. He represents the audience that Lawrence is ultimately trying to reach. People willing to surrender themselves completely to the illusion. And through him, the film, I think, celebrates the childlike delight of being scared in a safe environment. Whereas Anne, I think, is one of the film's quieter strengths, as you were saying also, Zan, because she's portrayed with warmth and resilience, carrying the burden of keeping the family together while her husband is away on military duty during a time of national uncertainty. She's not flashy or theatrical like Lawrence, but she has a quiet dignity that's every bit as compelling. What I appreciate the most about this character is that she never feels like a stereotypical movie mom. She's lonely and she's worried and occasionally overwhelmed, yet she remains emotionally available to her children. And I think the film doesn't ask to deliver grand speeches or dramatic confrontations. Instead, her strength is expressed through everyday acts of care and perseverance. So I think if you look at the family unit as a whole, it's a very believable family, as you guys were saying, because Gene is learning to understand the world, Dennis is still enchanted by it, and Anne is doing her best to provide stability while living through a very uncertain historical moment. And that family dynamic gives the film much of its emotional weight. I think without it, the film would simply be a charming homage to B-movie culture. With it, the story becomes a reflection on how ordinary families navigate fear and uncertainty and hope while finding comfort in shared experiences like an afternoon at the movies. So great characters for sure. So let's get to our burgeoning couple. We have Omri Katz as Stan and Kelly Martin, of course, as Sherry. So Zan, starting with you, what did you make of Stan and Sherry?
What I think is interesting about Stan and Sherry is that I feel like Stan is there more for Sherry's character growth than Sherry is for Stan's. I think because we've seen that story before where you have the guy that likes the girl, but the girl has the ex-boyfriend who threatens the guy. And so he makes up stupid lies about why he can't go with her and all of that. But we hear so much about Sherry's path that she's gone through, having dated Starkweather and trying to go back and forth with that, he's kind of a bad boy, but he's also a poet and he's very emotional. And she's just sort of figuring out what she wants, both emotionally and sexually. And, trying to basically tell Stan, I need Kelly Martin does this fabulous job of basically telling this kid in the 60s as a young teenager, I need a man who is emotionally in touch with himself and who can bring me to orgasm, which is hilarious. That is a hilarious concept for these kids, teaching her things about her body and her desires. It's just hearing her say that stuff is so adorable. And Stan has just been the typical kid that is, playing baseball, watching monster movies, playing with his buddies, and then now starts to notice girls. Like he's a very unexamined character. And I think he starts to like her because she's the cute girl, but obviously doesn't particularly know much about her. A lot of what he learns about her is through her kind of verbal, emotionally vomiting on him when they're walking home, and what Starkweather tells him. Good for him for at least listening, but he sort of has to figure out that he's not a kid anymore. And again, this movie plays on the old stereotype of girls mature faster than boys do, and their relationship is kind of the perfect example of that. But the main thing that I think can be taken from their story is, like I said, it goes in a very stereotypical way where, they run into each other at the theater and she's mad at him for lying. And then Jean tries to wingman for Stan and, talk her into giving him a second chance. But at the end of the day, what makes them seem like a good couple is the fact that they learn how to communicate with each other and look out for each other. They first of all, they have to deal with Starkweather, which is terrifying. He's scary because he is this really dangerous, abusive ex-boyfriend. But they sort of have to learn how to deal with that together and learn how to face that fear together and communicate with each other. And it's kind of adorable watching that happen through teenagers, seeing these kind of B-story kids building the foundation for an extremely healthy relationship later on. They're still just, even for what they've been through, they're fairly sheltered kids, even though they've been through a lot in, her having her relationship with Starkweather, and then both of them living through not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this movie. But they turn out to be kind of an adorable couple that you wind up rooting for, because, it at first it sort of seems like she's way more mature and faster than he needs, but he starts to figure out that, people are not that he needs to grow up, but that, that people are and relationships are more complicated than just liking the girl at school who's putting up the decorations. And so they're a cute couple that you do wind up rooting for, and not in that sort of, oh, every movie has to end with the guy getting the girl, even though this movie kind of does end like that, because you have Stan and Sherry, Jean and Sandra, and Lawrence and Ruth, that everybody does, almost literally ride off into the sunset. But it's in a different way. I feel like it's in a more nuanced way that, like I said before, gives credit to the maturity of kids that we don't usually see credit given to.
Very well said. As you were talking, and of course, we'll talk about Starkweather later on during the course of this podcast, but as you were talking about, especially Stan and Sherry's relationship, like, on another Earth, this movie was written by Stephen King, and things got really, really messy. But that's
right. Right.
I can only imagine Starkweather being written by Stephen King and this whole movie being a King film.
Well, I'm sure there's no coincidence that his name is Starkweather.
Exactly. And Sean, what did you make of Stan and Sherry?
Stan and Sherry are kind of set up to be that very stereotypical love interest. Like, oh, we got to have a love interest in the movie. Let's do this. And it definitely starts off that way with the trappings and the abusive boyfriend and things. But it succeeds, I think, largely based on the writing, which, again, the adults don't talk down to the kids, and the kids don't talk necessarily at a kid level. They're almost Peanuts characters, because they're discussing very large weight of the world things and sexuality and things that would normally be above their station. But it's also casting with Amori Katz as Stan, who quite shocking to know who he is later. He's from Hocus Pocus. And he's from, those are the, I know this kid, Erie, Indiana. Yeah, okay, cool. And then to see him in this and go, whoa, wow, look how young he is. And then on the flip side of that is Kelly Martin, who, it was funny because it wasn't until this go around, as many times as I'd seen this movie, I've always had the strangest crush on Sherry. And part of that, I think, is normal. Part of it, I think, is a little weird. But there was just something about Sherry that it's like, if I had a type, this would be it. But I don't think it's Sherry necessarily. I think it's her voice. It was this go-around with this film that I looked up Kelly Martin and what else has Kelly Martin done? And she's the voice of Roxanne in a Goofy movie. And all of a sudden, the cosmic tumbler, to borrow a line from Stephen King, clicked into place. And I went, oh, that explains it. Because Roxanne is another character that I have kind of a strange crush on whenever I watch a Goofy movie. And I think there's just something very subliminal about the softness of her voice, the tones that she uses, the way that she constructs a sentence when she speaks, that lulls me off into La La Land. It's like, yeah, okay, I'm down for whatever you want to do, hon. We're going to go look at Coral? We'll go look at Coral. I'm totally okay with that. And so the combination of the two of them together, I think they actually have very good chemistry. And it's very funny to see the two of them together. I also think it's very wise from a film standpoint that it was not Stan and Sherry that wound up locked in the bunker. I think we would have had a vastly different outcome with hinging the door off and the sudden reveal of, oh, we're saved, had it been them. But I love their relationship. I love that they fill these roles and that the movie allows us to kind of go along thinking it's this stereotypical thing. And then it isn't. And it becomes something a little different and a little deeper and a little more meaningful, only to circle back around with Starkweather and suddenly damsel in distress. And well, yeah, it is that relationship. We have to go save her. And so I love that it subverts my expectations just enough. And then we kind of flow back into the river from whence we came.
Very well said. And see, don't feel weird, Sean, because I feel exactly the way you do when you were talking about Kelly Martin. And I'm like, can we have Kelly Martin do some audiobooks, please? Because she does have such, I guess, as to quote Terry Pratchett, a voice that you can stroke. And that's how beautiful her voice is. These two are very interesting, I think, because they represent another side of the teenage world in the film. You know, the social, the romantic, and slightly awkward reality that exists alongside all the movie excitement. Stan very much feels like a very recognizable kind of adolescent figure. You know, he has a certain confidence and the desire to appear more worldly than he probably is. You know, he's not dealing with the larger questions of fear and uncertainty in the same way Gene is. Instead, he's focused on the immediate concerns of being young, which means fitting in, impressing people, and figuring out where he stands among his peers. I think that makes him a good contrast to Gene, who is more introspective and emotionally observant. You know, Stan is more concerned with navigating the present moment. And what I like about him is that he isn't written as a simple comic sidekick or a stereotypical teenage rival. He has his own insecurities and his own way of making sense of things. You know, he represents the everyday teenage experience that continues even when history feels overwhelming. The world may be on edge, but teenagers are still worrying about friendships and reputation and relationships. Sherry, I think, is one of those characters who could have easily have become a stereotype. You know, on paper, she is the pretty cheerleader, the girl who cares about fashion and dating and popularity. And we've seen that character countless times before. What I think makes Sherry work is that Matinee never treats her with contempt, and Kelly never plays her as a joke. And I think there is an innocence to her that feels genuine. She's not cruel. She's not manipulative. She doesn't use people for attention. In fact, she's surprisingly trusting. And when Stan shows interest in her, she responds with warmth rather than calculation. You know, when he doesn't show up, she doesn't lash out or become vindictive. She's simply hurt, the way any teenager would be. And once she understands what really happened, she lets go of her disappointment remarkably quickly. And I think that willingness to forgive says a great deal about her character. I think she embodies very much that whole concept because you know she's not she very much is about the early 1960s. She embodies that optimism of that era before the world changed. You know, while the Cuban Missile Crisis looms over the story, she's still concerned with dates and dances and romance. Some might call that shallow, but I see it differently. She's living the ordinary life that millions of teenagers wanted to preserve while the adults were worried about nuclear war. Her concerns are small, I think, only because she's fortunate enough to still have the luxury of them. I will briefly touch up on Harvey here as well before we talk about him in greater length later. I mean, I think their relationship hints at something darker beneath the bright colors and the upbeat music. You know, his possessiveness isn't romantic, it's threatening. And Sherry's attempts to move on from him do suggest a young woman trying to reclaim her independence, even if she doesn't articulate it in those terms. I mean, the film doesn't dwell on this subplot, but I think it's enough to add another layer to her character. What I think Kelly contributes to this character is subtle, but it's essential. She could have exaggerated Sherry's flirtatiousness or played her as an airhead. Instead, I think she gives her sincerity. You believe Sherry laughs because she's enjoying herself, that she smiles because she's genuinely happy, and that she cries because she's genuinely hurt. There's no sense that she's performing for an audience. Perhaps I think that's why she remains memorable despite relatively little screen time. You know, in a film filled with eccentric movie producers and horror gimmicks, it's Cold War paranoia and adolescent adventures, Sherry quietly reminds us that ordinary kindness has its own dramatic value. She's not the intellectual like Sandra, nor the dreamer like Jean, nor the showman like Lawrence. She's simply a decent young woman trying to enjoy being 17. And perhaps that's her greatest strength. She never has to become extraordinary for the audience to care about her. She simply has to be believable. And I think Kelly achieves exactly that. She turns what could have been a disposable supporting role into someone who feels like a real girl living through an extraordinary moment in American history, unaware of that both her world and the country's are about to change forever. The nice thing about Stan and Sherry's relationship is their presence, I think, keeps the film from becoming too focused on nostalgia for childhood. I think it reminds us that adolescence isn't only about monsters and movies and imagination. It's also about attraction and embarrassment and social expectations and the confusing process of becoming a person. So I think in the larger structure of the film, they help create a fuller picture of youth during that period. As I said before, you know, Jean is the thoughtful observer, Dennis is the child still embracing pure wonder, and Stan and Sherry represent the ordinary teenage world continuing around them. I think they show that even during moments of historical anxiety. You know, people still fall in love, they tease each other, they seek approval, and they try to understand who they are. And that balance is one of the film's strengths. It doesn't treat the past as a simpler, more innocent time. It remembers that people in every era were complicated, distracted, and hopeful, and nervous, and trying to enjoy themselves despite whatever fears surrounded them. It almost makes me think of the COVID era, if you will, when it was a crazy time, but we still tried to make of it what we could and still tried to do what we could. So let's get to another important love interest, which we have touched up somewhat. We have the wonderful Lisa Jacob as Sandra. So Sean, starting with you, what did you make of this character?
Sandra's another one that I have a low-key crush on. I first became really aware of Lisa Jacob in the I believe it was 99, short film George Lucas in Love, which if you've not seen, I highly recommend. It is a slight spoof of Shakespeare in Love, only replacing Shakespeare in this case with a young George Lucas who is struggling to complete his screenplay about space oats. And Lisa Jacob is Marion, who is his becomes his muse in crafting the Star Warsian story. Whip smart, cute as a button, and got the Princess Leia due. So what is there not to be crushing on there? It was not until many years later that I realized, oh wait, I've seen Lisa Jacob in everything. That she's the one sister in Independence Day. That she's the older daughter in Mrs. Doubtfire, and so she kind of has that air about her in all of these roles of being a little wiser, beyond her years, and still slightly bemused at whatever situation is going on, whether it is, a supporting role or a starring one that she finds herself in. And so with Sandra, when we are first introduced to the character and she is, fighting the fight and ranting and raving about, putting your head down on the floor and covering it with your hands is not going to protect you from a nuclear bomb, which is something that I don't think we thought about a lot. I'm old enough to remember the occasional bomb drill where we had to get down, or not so much for the bombs. It was mainly more here for tornadoes. But feeling that kinship with a movie character who was like, oh yeah, I know what they're doing. And no, hiding underneath the kindling is not going to help you. Quite in fact, quite the opposite. You're going to ensure that you're going to become roasty. And at first glance, she comes across as a very blatant stereotype. We need an aggressive scouring pad of a character to go up against Jean, somebody that's going to rail against the authority and be the protester and smart beyond her years and can put the teachers in her place so that he will, fall for her. And at that first glance, you would think, no kid is like this. This is a complete fabrication of a writer who got in a little over their head because this is what they wanted. And, there's no basis on a real person here until we meet Sandra's parents. And then suddenly all of that personality clicks into place and you go, oh yeah, she's totally their kid. That, it's one of those wonderful moments that it's very understated. It's very just, here they are. And you kind of go along with it. And if you're not paying attention, you miss it. You wouldn't have any, real understanding of the family dynamic there. But then you see it and you look at them and you're like, of course she's your kid. Of course this is how this works. Of course she's going to be reacting this way because you have been properly indoctrinating her into the BS meter of the world at that point. And so the combination of that element to her character and Lisa Jacobs' wonderful performance of being able to reside in that stereotype, but look out with these kind of seasoned eyes that know better. And it's another one that works. And I think her interactions with Jean take on a different, really a kind of a different tone altogether, because whereas she should have every reason to dismiss him as the military kid. She's genuinely curious about, have my parents indoctrinated me, against something that maybe, that they shouldn't have, did they not understand what's going on? Because Gene is so honest with her and kind of lost and not really sure what he's looking for, but he's captivated by her. He's intrigued by her. I think he's very much a little scared of her, as all men should be. Fellas, this is a firecracker, and you got to watch out for these types, because if you mishandle the firecracker, you lose the fingers. That's rule one of that. And she's just such a powerhouse of a character, and it's great. And then Jean, kind of little lost lamb, comes into her sphere of influence, and okay, so that tilts that, and then it culminates when they get locked in the bunker at the end of the film, and the terror of that. I mean, you think about that the vault door closes, boom, and the locks and the things, and you're cut off. And then you hear, which of course we know is Rumble-Rama. But if you're in that environment, that could sound a lot like a nuke going off, and suddenly realizing that your friends, the family, the brother, the parents, everything's gone. And what now? At this age, and the slow realization. I love that there's no panic, that they keep it internalized. Because again, I think had the kids panicked, suddenly we've moved into a different feeling for this film. And we want them to be scared, but then we want to show that everything's okay. And I think the panic would have taken it into another direction. So they keep that internalized, and very logically in Lisa Jacobs' character, Sandra's case, okay, what do we do now? Well, if this is the case, if we've gotten through this, well, then it's up to us to repopulate the earth. And she's not looking at it as a romantic interlude, which is what would have happened with Stan and Sherry. She's looking at it as, this is my responsibility as a member of the human race, as a member of whatever society we're going to bring forth into the world. And Gene has just enough sense of duty from his father to kind of go, yeah. And again, because he recognizes that she is the alpha in this situation, that he's not pursuing it, he's just going along with it. And it's just, we get all the way up to that point, and then the door comes off. And of course, who levers the door off the hinges? Woolsey, who any other producer would be like, call the fire department, call somebody. I've got a movie premiere to deal with. He is, this is literally the culmination of all of this work is going on upstairs. And instead, he's downstairs with a crowbar and a sledgehammer, and he's rescuing these kids from this fool of a theater owner who decided to drill a hole in the wall and install a bank safe. What's up with that? And, he's rolling up his sleeves again. He's taking care of the job at hand. And it's another humanization moment for him that's great. But their whole relationship is kind of boiled down to that moment of, well, yeah, it's our responsibility. And honestly, between the two, I feel like this relationship probably is going to succeed. Whereas, unfortunately, Stan and Sherry are going to be together for, a couple of years through the rest of high school. And then there will be a breakup and it will probably go badly. And Stan will be, he will become a depressed writer who drinks too much while she's off with somebody else on the football team or something. I don't mean to belittle Sherry as being selfish or vapid or any stretch of that imagination, but it just, this relationship, because it comes from a different place than the physical attraction that I think Stan and Sherry share. So I think this is the one that for me feels like it would probably work out in the long run.
That's a very interesting theory. I guess if we ever had the sequel, we'd call it Soiree, since we have Matinee here, and guess like things may get a little bit darker when it comes to the sequel. Who knows? But in the meantime, Zan, what did you brought her up a few times? So, what are your thoughts on Sandra?
I did, and I think she's another good example of a well-written kid of substance in this movie. But at the same time, she also kind of runs into the same pitfalls that the other kids have of just kind of regurgitating what she's heard at home and not really knowing how to pick her battles with it, getting in trouble by yelling during the duck and cover drill. They're lying to you. And it's like when you start yelling during something, that's when you sort of sound like you're the crazy person, where she could, maybe print up some flyers or something, break into the school mimeo machine and get those printed up. She's also, you can tell the frustration of her coming from the type of family that she has, and then having to go to school and being taught this stuff that she knows is bullshit. And it's one thing to grow up, everybody at some point grows up and realizes that their education was not perfect. And that, you always have that moment where you realize, oh, my teacher's an idiot. We all have those moments in our lives, at least hopefully we do. But with her, the stakes are so much higher because the lies can literally kill them. This is a possible war we're talking about here, and we've got a turtle telling us that if we just put our heads down, we're going to be fine. Like, what the? Come on, that's not how this works. And her frustration is just so palpable, of the frustration of being a kid and not being validated, and just sort of being herded into the hallway like cattle, and being expected to duck and cover just because the teacher said you're supposed to. And I love that aspect of her character, that you can tell she's just so incredibly frustrated by the bullshit that, her parents have taught her is bullshit, yet still are sending her to public school and, saying, okay, now that you know the world is bullshit, learn how to interact with a bullshit world. And I see myself a lot in her as well, just being, definitely from, leftist parents with very strong beliefs about censorship and very open communication about things. I do love, but this is our second David Clennon movie in a month. Her dad is played by David Clennon, who is Amazing Amy's dad in Gone Girl. And I love his reaction when they rescue them from the bomb shelter, and he just has that eye roll of like, oh, of course there's a boy down here. Like, this is but you can sort of tell that her parents kind of have an appreciation for understanding what adolescence is really like. That, oh God, here we go, boys. I guess we're there. He has that kind of look about him where, they're worried about what was happening, because it was a crazy day with, Rumble Rama tearing the theater apart and everybody thinking the bomb had dropped, and then, getting locked into a bomb shelter. But yeah, this is a very different bomb shelter love scene than the one we see in Grease 2. It's very earnest. It's very serious. It's very like, well, this is what we've been told is going to happen, and now we're here, and here's what we have to do. And again, I feel like this is a couple, like Sean was saying, this is a couple with a little bit more substance. I think Stan and Sherry are getting there, but I think Jean and Sandra have been more thoughtful, introspective, observant kids for much longer. They are the older souls of the adolescents in this story. And yeah, Lisa Jacob is perfect for this, because she's and just even the costuming and hair design in this movie is really well done as well, because you see Kelly Martin's character, Sherry's character, she has that typical 60s hair, typical 60s dress, whereas Sandra has the flatter hair. She's wearing a dress because she has to, and then outside of school she's in the cutoffs. She's a little bit more substance driven rather than, not that there's not substance to fashion. I've seen Devil Wears Prada. I know what goes into a pile of stuff, but there's just more to her than high school. Whereas I think for a while that was kind of what Sherry was living for. And again, we have a couple that we're rooting for here. I mean, you kind of do root for all of the couples in this movie. And I like that they portray a girl like Sandra as a love interest, as an aspirational figure. She's not just Sherry's weird cousin or something. She's somebody that Jean likes for substance reasons. And for me as a kid who was never going to, wear dresses or do my hair at school, and who was demisexual before she knew there was a word for that, having a movie where you see a guy interested in a girl in high school for her substance, that was like, where's that? Where was that for me? I was almost out of high school when this movie came out. So, I really like this character. I like the performance of it. And I like the portrayal of how they are sort of expected to be beyond their years, both Jean and Sandra. But when they get together, they're very much just kids. And it's very sweet to watch that they're just kids figuring this stuff out together, and that they have each other to figure it out with.
They're certainly very lucky indeed to have each other when it comes to figuring things out, for sure, Zan. And I agree with you, because Sandra is not just the girl that Jean likes. She does represent the part of the movie that refuses to let nostalgia become too comfortable. While much of the film celebrates the excitement of monster movies and theatrical gimmicks and childhood thrills, Sandra, I think, keeps bringing attention back to the reality underneath all the spectacle, the very real fear of nuclear war. What makes her interesting, I think, though, is that she isn't simply pessimistic. She can seem severe, even intimidating, because she's willing to say things that other people would rather avoid. During the air raid drill, for example, she challenges the comforting idea that official procedures can make an unimaginable disaster feel manageable. And I think her skepticism comes from a genuine moral concern rather than a desire to be difficult. That, I think, does make her a fascinating match for Jean, because he, as you guys were saying, he is drawn toward imagination and fantasy and the emotional escape offered by movies, whereas Sandra is more focused on truth and consequences and confronting uncomfortable realities. At first, they do seem almost like opposites. He finds meaning in illusion while she questions illusion itself. But the film gradually shows that they actually need each other. Jean helps Sandra reconnect with moments of joy and play, while Sandra encourages Jean to think more deeply about the world beyond entertainment. And I also like that this character is not written as a typical 1960s dream girl. She isn't there simply to admire Jean or make him seem more mature. She has her own convictions and her own frustrations and her own perspective. And I think her intelligence is part of her appeal. But the film also allows her to be vulnerable and uncertain. And beneath the seriousness, yes, she's still a teenager trying to understand a frightening world. And I think her relationship with Jean in the fallout shelter is especially revealing because the situation strips away their usual roles. The outspoken activist and the thoughtful movie fan, like you were saying, Zan, are suddenly just two young people scared by the possibility of being alone in a ruined world. And in that moment, the film suggests that fear and hope can exist together. And in some ways, I think Sandra is the perfect counterpart to Lawrence Woolsey, because Lawrence creates artificial fear in order to entertain and bring people together. Sandra worries about the real fear that people are trying not to face. One is a magician of anxiety. The other is someone trying to look directly at it. Yeah, I think by the end, Matinee suggests that both perspectives have value. We need imagination to survive fear, but we also need people willing to remind us what is real. And I think that's what makes Sandra such a strong character, because she prevents the film from becoming just a warm memory of simpler times. And through her, the film remembers that the early 1960s were not only about drive-ins, monster movies, and youthful excitement. They were also about uncertainty, activism, and young people beginning to question the world they inherited. And yes, we love Lisa Jacob, we very much do. So let's round off our characters with two other entertaining characters. Of course, we have the aforementioned Robert Picardo as Howard, our theatre manager, and James Villemer, of course, as Harvey Starkweather, our juvenile delinquent and aspiring poet. So, Zan, starting with you, what did you make of Harvey and Howard?
Well, Robert Picardo is just always fantastic, and he's fun when he's Weasley like this. And when I said before that the marketing of this movie, I think, focused a little too much on the Wonder Years aspect of it. I love that Robert Picardo is in it because he was also in the Wonder Years. And his character is kind of just there to give us exposition a little bit because, he's there for us to have to, he's who the movie is explaining things to, really. He's who we explain Rumble Rama to. And he's who explains to the audience the concept of bomb shelters and that level of paranoia and fear going on. And his character is there to explain to the audience why we can't fit a lot of people into the balcony and what's wrong with the balcony. And so I think Robert Picardo does an adorable job of basically being the exposition character. There's not a ton to him. He is kind of weaselly and kind of, not terribly likable. One of those guys in a profession who makes a lot of money off of kids, but doesn't necessarily respect them as people all that much. And Robert Picardo is just great and entertaining. And I think he was a good choice for that because he can go on an entertaining rant about, humidity and termites. And that's why we can't be in the balcony. Starkweather, on the other hand, is a kind of a terrifying character because, and he's so interesting too, because on the one hand, he represents the emotional aspect of kids, boys of his time, where struggles were not the whole suck it up aspect of 50s and 60s appearances of how things are. You just need to sort of suck it up and fly right type of thing. But that when you think about a character like this who has really no other real good outlet for his anger or what's going on in his life, and other than poetry that is probably getting him called terrible names in this era, and you sort of see what a lack of focus on emotional intelligence can do to a person, especially somebody with a terrifying streak of anger that can lead to violence. And what's interesting about this movie is that he's played for laughs as sort of the dumb juvenile delinquent. But watching this movie, you realize just kind of how scary he really is as the kid with nothing to lose. Like I've said before, like when you're watching a movie like Back to the Future, the Biff character sort of played for laughs as like the dumb bully. But when we get to the scene, the rape scene in Back to the Future, and he says, McFly, just shut the door, turn around and walk away. It's terrifying. And her going, George, help me. It's really scary. The movie gets really dark for a few minutes, really quick. And this is a similar thing where not only is it's comedically done because he's dressed up in the Mant suit, which is basically a rubber head on some sweatpants. And we watch him throughout the movie. We see him starting to boil over, where he calls up Stan and says, hey, I saw you with my girl. She's not your girl anymore. Don't care. She's my girl. Stay away from her. So you see him threatening violence with Stan, and you're like, wow, if he's doing that with Stan, what's he doing with her? And, her talking about how I see now that he was not good. He was not good for me. And I've often said that bad guys are like the Matrix. You can't be told, you have to be shown. And she's learning. You don't have a situation where the day is saved because Sherry goes back with Starkweather. And I love that about this movie, that she doesn't decide she'd rather have the bad boy and then stands left as the comic foil third wheel for the Jean and Sandra couple. He gets his just desserts in this movie. He goes to jail because not only does he turn up Rumble Rama to 5, which he's not supposed to do, he starts a panic and destroys a theater and tries to kidnap somebody with a knife, where he's realizing what he's done and how, the law is going to come and he's going to have to run away. And, Sherry, you're going to come with me. He gets real scary real fast. And like I said, it's a similar formula where he's sort of played for laughs, but when you think about him, he's really kind of terrifying. And what's interesting is to see him played by, again, the hair and the costuming in this movie is great. He has the greaser hair and the leather jacket, but he looks like a baby. I mean, you can tell he's very young, and he looks like a baby, and he's not having the success that our other characters are having with trying to figure out adolescence. There's obviously something going on in his life that is also traumatic that he's not handling very well. We don't really learn much about what that is, but he's scary. And this movie doesn't, like I said, he's sort of played for laughs, but at the same time doesn't shy away from the fact that this is a scary guy, and that what needs to happen to the scary guys at the end of the movie is they need to not get the girl. They need to be taken away in a police car, and a fate of jail happens. While he is a kid, and you can have some sympathy for the fact, like I said, you have sympathy for what a lack of focus on emotional intelligence can do to a generation. You also see that he's the only kid making this kind of mischief. Choices are made. And, maybe he turned up the machine. Maybe his one day of training for his one day of work made him turn the machines up too high and destroy the theater. And, also almost killed Jean's little brother, who went up into the balcony. At the end of the day, he puts a knife to Sherry and tries to kidnap her. And the movie does not reward that. And I love that about this movie as well.
I 100% agree. As I'd mentioned before, I think had he been written by Stephen King, he'd be another Henry Bowers from It, of course. And that
he's such a Henry Bowers, yeah.
Exactly. And plus, those events did take place in 1962, so we would be in the same era roughly in the same era when it comes to this. And Sean, what did you make of the Henry Bowers of this movie and our theater manager?
It's a really interesting analysis, Zan, with Henry, because I've always admired that for a villain who is played for laughs, that he is. I mean, he's a tough guy who recites poetry. Okay, yeah, look at this. Look at the dichotomy of things we've got going on here. But he's also the greaser. He's the 50s era tough guy, but we're in the 60s. And so he is representative of a world that has gone away, much like Woolsey's monster movies are kind of from a bygone era, because Hollywood wasn't making a whole slew of these, atomic radiation movies as we got later into the 60s. The audience had changed. They had grown up somewhat unwillingly because of the events of the world. But he represents this, kind of lost moment in time, character-wise. And so he's always struck me as almost a tragic figure that has lost his way. And I don't mean to say that with any real sympathy for the guy. He's a jerk and totally got what was coming to him, and deservedly so. And at least we forget, not only does he kidnap Sherry, he attempts to kidnap Ruth. He's got a knife at her throat, first of all. And, he swaps out once he gets what he wants. But it's he's far more dangerous than he lets on. And I think, especially in light of current political pressures on this idea of returning to the supposed values of a time long gone, I think he's just smart enough to know that his place in the world is gone, that the world has moved on without him. And he's lashing out at anything and everything he can to try and hold on to what's his. And his misguided notion of what's his is Sherry, that, that this girl that he took advantage of and, brainwashed a little bit to be his girl. And how dare she go off and have a life of his own after I went to jail? That's just silly talk. It's mine. And so hearing you equate him to Biff, who is another in a just absolutely fascinating pantheon of movie characters that are played for laughs, but have that underlying menace to them. I've always felt as much. I mean, Back to the Future's in my top 5 of all time, and I think it's, even as successful as it is, I still think it's criminally underrated. I think Back to the Future is the greatest trilogy ever written, and I'll have words with anyone that says otherwise. And Biff Tannen is kind of right on the forefront of, let's make him goofy. And it's kind of almost like, Spielberg Nazis in an Indiana Jones film, that they're too goofy and idiotic to be effective, but we kind of have to remember, they're Nazis. They were not the Keystone Cops that the film sometimes portrays them to be. And Biff was not the manure swallowing idiot that he kind of got painted into that corner. And that rape scene is terrifying. And I think Starkweather has a very common ancestor thread with that level of potential violence. But fortunately, because we're on that knife's edge of not going too kitschy, but also not allowing the Cuban Missile Crisis to really become a thing, for that same reason, we're not going to allow him to tip over and make this into a legit Stephen King horror movie. But it was interesting you said that. I had not really considered him in that light before until now. And you're absolutely right. With Howard, I have every time I see Robert Picardo, regardless of the performance, I think back to a convention that I went to in Kansas City, which was specifically a Star Trek convention, and he was there. And I had been fretting all day because we were running behind. I was kind of dragging my wife at the time along with, and she was being very dig in her heels. I don't want to go. I don't care. This is not for me. And I was worried that we were going to miss stuff. And, rightfully so. You got panels, you got timed events that happen. And we got there with just enough time for me to dive into Robert Picardo's autograph line. And we had missed his panel. We had missed his this. We'd missed, there was so much other stuff going on throughout the day that just, we didn't get there until like 2 p.m. Who doesn't get to a convention until 2 p.m, you ask? Well, this guy sometimes. So I dove into the autograph line, and I had to sweet talk my way past the gatekeepers. It's like, I've got this poster. I came all the way, please, 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 please. And they're like, all right. They took pity on me and got up there. Are you doing a show? I am. Got up there, and he smiled. Very gracious, very wonderful performer. And the guy ahead of me, I had no idea what I was going to say. I was completely like, I spent so much time and effort and focus getting up here. Now I'm kind of like, I'm trying to reset my brain. And the guy ahead of me says, I really like you on Voyager, but your best role was as a cowboy in Joe Dante's Inner Space. And Picardo laughed and went, oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. And he signs this thing and sends him on. And I come out with this big Voyager poster of the whole crew, and he kind of smirks and starts to sign. And I say, don't let him fool you. I enjoy you in Inner Space, But your best role was as the alien in Explorers, which if you've ever seen Explorers, he's completely covered
nice
up in
one.
rubber, Brack. He's just this inflatable alien with tentacles and suction cups on his fingers and everything. And he threw his head back and laughed and went, "Oh God, no." And it was an interaction that I treasured. I kind of put that in the, yeah, look at me go, boy, I got one. But it apparently had a lasting effect, because years later at a galley, a Doctor Who convention in LA, he happened to be there because it's in LA. So occasionally stars are like, well, I don't have anything going on this weekend. I'll go show up at the Doctor Who con and sign a few autographs. And so he was there, and we went up to talk to him and said, I don't know if you remember, but I saw you in Kansas City and I mentioned Explorer. He goes, oh, I remember you. Oh, I remember you. So whenever I see Robert Picardo in a film, that's the Robert Picardo that I'm thinking of, regardless of how weaselly his character is or not. And his movie theater owner is just such a kind of a delightful, he's almost the delightful scamp that we thought that Goodman was going to be initially, because, you know, as Zan pointed out, he makes all this money off of kids. I don't think he likes kids very much. I mean, he's not completely dismissive of them. He's very aware of what they bring to his business from a financial standpoint. But he's also, you know, he knows what side the bread is buttered on. And, oh, the atomic bomb is going to fall and I'm going to be in the basement and I don't care one fig for the rest of these kids. You know, I'm going to rope off the balcony, but I'm not going to monitor it. And so he does all these things that you kind of feel like are, dude, but then he's got his goldfish and he's going to save the goldfish along with himself and into this atomic nuclear fallout blasted, you know, horrible wasteland of a future. But the goldfish will be right, to the point where he then leaves the safety of the vault to go get food because he forgot to bring food in because he's so frazzled with everything else. And it's like, you're really kind of an interesting guy. I can't hate you totally, because I'm not supposed to. I'm just supposed to laugh at you like you're kind of a nerd and a tool, but you're maybe not horrible. And again, the casting, whoever cast this movie should just be given all the awards, because you understood the assignment. You got the right people in the right roles for the right time. And he's another. It's just one more reason I love this film.
And understandably so, because, and I love that anecdote that you shared with us, Sean. That is fantastic. And heck, you know, at least Robert Picardo will always remember you made an impact. And that is definitely something. I will say this, you know, to piggyback off what you were saying, Howard is someone whose imagination has been captured by a much larger, more terrifying possibility. I mean, because his concern about nuclear annihilation isn't just a passing fear. It has become something that shapes how he sees the world. And in that sense, he's actually much closer to Sandra almost, because both of them are people who cannot easily accept the comforting reassurances that everything is fine. The irony is, as you were pointing out, that Howard works in the business of manufactured fear while being consumed by a very real one. You know, once again, Lawrence creates controlled scares for entertainment, you know, carefully designing an experience where audiences can feel threatened without actually being in danger. Whereas Howard is focused on the kind of fear that has no curtain call and no safety mechanism. You know, the threat of nuclear war represents something beyond anyone's ability to stage or to control. And that makes his relationship with the movie theater particularly interesting. You know, the theater is supposed to be a place where people gather to forget their worries for a while. But Howard can't fully escape the larger reality hanging over the era. You know, he sees the danger beneath the excitement. Where others are enjoying the fantasy of monsters, he's thinking about the possibility of a real-world catastrophe. At the same time, I don't think the film portrays him as foolish or merely paranoid. His fear does reflect a genuine historical reality. I mean, I wasn't around, of course, but the early 1960s were a period when nuclear anxiety was deeply embedded in everyday life. And Matinee is careful not to dismiss that. Howard, I think, represents the adults who had to carry that awareness while still trying to go to work, raise families, and maintain some sense of normal life. What's especially interesting is how this character contrasts with Lawrence, because Lawrence understands fear as a communal experience, something people can laugh at, scream at, and enjoy together. Howard experiences fear as isolation, something that keeps him awake and makes the world feel fragile. One transforms fear into entertainment, and the other struggles with fear as a fact of existence. And that also makes the theatre itself a fitting setting for their conflict, because it becomes a place where artificial fears and genuine fears collide. A monster movie can make an audience scream, but it cannot prepare them for the possibility of the world ending. Yet, ironically, I think the act of gathering together, watching a film, and sharing an experience might be exactly what people need when facing that kind of uncertainty. So I think Howard is one of the film's most quietly tragic characters. He's not just a man worried about whether the show will work. He's someone trying to live in a world where the biggest threat imaginable is also completely outside his control. And I think his fear gives the movie a seriousness beneath all the charm and nostalgia. So getting to Harvey Starkweather, I agree, he's almost a dark mirror image of the movie's youthful characters, because at first, he seems like a classic teenage bully or delinquent, but the film makes him stranger and more pathetic than that. He's not simply a villain. He's someone who has become trapped in his own performance of toughness, as you guys were saying. The interesting thing about Harvey is that he fits perfectly into Lawrence's world, because Lawrence understands that audiences respond to monsters and fear, and Harvey literally becomes a monster for the show by wearing the Mant costume. The tragedy is that Harvey cannot separate the performance from reality. Everyone else understands the rules of the game. The monster is fake, the scares are controlled, and the danger is part of the fun. Harvey doesn't have that at distance. And his aggression comes from insecurity and a desperate need for control. His obsession with Sherry and his hostility towards Stan reveals someone who doesn't know how to handle rejection or embarrassment in a healthy way. He wants to be feared because being feared feels like the only way he can matter. And that makes him also an interesting contrast to Gene, because Gene is fascinated by monsters because he understands their fictional creations. Harvey becomes a monster because he doesn't know where the act ends. One finds comfort in fantasy, the other gets consumed by it. And I also think Harvey is important because he shows that the movie isn't only about charming nostalgia. The film remembers that the early 1960s weren't just a time of innocence and Saturday matinees. There were real tensions among young people too. Anger and insecurity and confusion. And Harvey is the uncomfortable reminder that not every kind of fear comes from the big things happening in the world. So I think ultimately together, these two characters almost form a strange pair of opposites. Howard is an adult surrounded by chaos who tries to keep things grounded. Harvey is a young person surrounded by fantasy who loses his grip on reality. One represents responsibility, the other represents what happens when responsibility and emotional maturity haven't developed yet. They're both essential because they keep the movie from becoming pure nostalgia. The film loves movies, but it also understands the messy human beings watching them, which I think is very important. So let's get to how this movie ended. Of course, after the Cuban Missile Crisis has ended, hooray, Ruth and Lawrence leave for another premiere in Cleveland, Ohio, bidding goodbye to Sandra and Jean. Lawrence has grown fond of the two kids, telling Ruth he might like to have children after they marry. Sandra and Jean watch them drive away in Lawrence's new 1961 Cadillac, and Navy helicopters fly over the beaches in Key West, implying that Jean's father will soon return home. So, Sean, starting with you, what did you make of how the movie ended?
Well, it ended exactly as how it needed to. It's a perfect fairy tale ending where evil has been vanquished and the good triumphed, and the movie was revealed to be, a movie, nothing too scary, although there were some intense moments, and you got back out into the sunshine and thought to yourself, "Thank God, everything's all right." And we drive off into the sunset, and Woolsey has the line about the kids, kind of implying that maybe he's grown up a bit. Maybe this experience has transformed him from the rather large man-child that he is to somebody that might be willing to handle a bit more responsibility. But he also has to ask Ruth for money to tip the driver who brings his new caddy around. So maybe not. And we get a hopeful Jean and why can I not remember her name?
Sandra
on the beach, watching this helicopter, which the length of time we spend on the helicopter before the fade out certainly seems to imply that it's carrying Jean's dad. It's not just a helicopter, it's the helicopter. Dad's coming home, and won't this be great? And you'll get a chance to meet him, which hopefully goes well. But yeah, it's a perfect movie with a perfect ending. It's exactly what you needed after all that.
Well said. And Zan, while you wait for Lawrence's new 1961 Cadillac to pull up in Cleveland, Ohio, what did you make of the ending?
Yeah, I wish I could have been there for that. Sean's right. It's exactly how it should have ended. And it does a great job of ending the way the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, where it just was, okay, Russia says they're going to dismantle the bombs and they're going to take them away, and life goes back to as normal as it can. But things are different. There's a paranoia now of somebody can come get us. And that was not, we'd gone through 2 world wars that didn't really affect us geographically speaking. And we had confidence bordering on hubris at the time. And the Cuban Missile Crisis showed us, no, it can get here. It can get here. It can be frightening. And I think we have those moments as a country. We had a civil war, then we had a Civil War Part 2, basically, with our War of 1812. And then most of our wars have been elsewhere. But we have things that show us, things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, things like 9/11, that show us things can happen here, and things get scary, and we get paranoid, and things get different, and we can either be vigilant, or we can be cynical, or we can be both, or we can be paranoid, or we can be blindly optimistic, and I think what happens to all the characters at the end of this, and we've talked before how when we have a movie that takes place in a certain time of history, it ends the way it ends because that's how it ended. But this one ends with not just how it ended, but how it changed people. How it, even if, like Sean was saying, even if the glimpses of maturity are only for a few minutes, it made people, forced people to think about things. It forced people to think about what they want, who they are, and what's really important. And like I said, I do really, my favorite thing about the end of this movie is that Starkweather doesn't stop because Sherry says she'll go with him. And I think that there are a ton of movies that could have gone that way. He stops because he needs to be removed from this town. He needs to be removed from this part of the culture. And like Sean was saying, there's not a place for him anymore. He looks like a 50s greaser into the 60s. His relevance is gone, and there's not much left for someone who makes those kinds of choices when their relevance is threatened. And I love that wasn't the resolution for him. That it wasn't like, oh, I'll wait for you and I'll write to you and send me poems from prison. It could have done that, and it didn't. And that's my favorite thing about the end of this movie.
I am so glad that was the case as well. It's like, oh, she's gone with a bad boy and she leaves a nice guy in the dirt, or in the dust rather. And I'm so glad that Joe Dante and his writers decided not to do that. And yes, I think the ending of the film is one of the reasons the film works so well. It could have easily gone in a purely nostalgic direction, ending as a simple celebration of old monster movies and childhood memories. Instead, it brings together all of the film's ideas about fear, illusion, reality, and the strange comfort of shared experiences. What I love most is that the climax deliberately blurs the line between a staged scare and a genuine crisis. And throughout the film, Lawrence has been a master of creating controlled terror. He understands how to manipulate an audience's emotions, how to make people scream and then laugh afterwards because they know they were safe all along. But during the final screening, the audience is confronted with a different kind of fear, one that isn't part of the show. And the possibility of nuclear war turns the theater's artificial horror into something painfully real. That contrast is what gives the ending its emotional power. For a moment, the audience isn't just watching a monster movie. They're experiencing what people of that era actually lived with. The fear that the world could change forever in an instant. And the film doesn't mock that fear or suggest it was irrational. Instead, it acknowledges it while also showing how people found ways to endure it. The theater itself also becomes almost symbolic. It is a shelter, but not just in the physical sense. It's a place where people gather, where strangers become a community, where fear is shared rather than faced alone. And even though movies cannot solve the world's problems as much as we wish they could, they can create moments of connection and reassurance. And that's ultimately what the film believes in. And I also appreciate that the ending doesn't turn Lawrence into a fraud or view his showmanship as meaningless. If anything, it proves why his work matters. He's not pretending that monsters are real. He's giving people a safe place to experience fear, to laugh afterward, and to remember that they can face frightening things together. And the illusion, I think, has value because everyone understands it is an illusion. The final emotional note, with Gene looking back on the experience is also beautifully handled. The film isn't simply saying those were better days. It recognizes that the past was complicated. The world was frightening, and sadly still is today. Adults were anxious, children were growing up under extraordinary pressures, but there were still moments of wonder and friendship and laughter and discovery. And for me, the ending captures the whole spirit of the movie. Fear is unavoidable, but humans have always responded to fear by creating stories and rituals and shared experiences. We build theaters, we tell ghost stories, we make monsters, and we gather together in the dark because sometimes facing an imaginary nightmare helps us find the courage to face a real one. And I think it's surprisingly a profound ending for a film that spends so much time celebrating a rubber monster and a theatrical gimmick. It understands that the magic of movies was never just about escaping reality. Sometimes it was about finding a way to return to reality, feeling a little less alone. And that's why we love movies, folks. And that's why I love this ending. So let's get to with the Academy segment. Sadly, this film was not nominated for anything, but could have been eligible for the 66 Academy Awards, where the film with the most awards and statues was, speaking of Nazis, Schindler's List. So I guess, Zan, at this point, starting with you, should have or could have this movie been nominated for anything, and why do you think the Academy ignored it?
You're not going to get the Academy, first of all, overlooks comedies a lot of the time, and you're not going to get it to look at a comedy in the same year as we have a masterpiece like Schindler's List. That's not going anywhere, unfortunately. I always love to see John Goodman, and I think he could get a Best Supporting Actor in just about anything he does. For that, the what I might say for something like this would be this could possibly get a screenplay. Nothing against Nora Ephron, but I feel like we've seen Sleepless in Seattle before. I feel like this is a different type of feel good love story that I think it could have been a contender for that. But at the end of the day, it's still a comedy. So I don't have a lot of high hopes for it. And again, Jerry Goldsmith, I'll always hand another Oscar to Jerry Goldsmith whenever I get the opportunity.
Very well said. And Sean, of course, you are often part of the Academy Awards games and so on, which we do have on online and what have you. Do you think this film should have been nominated for anything? And why do you think the Academy completely ignored it?
Are you crazy? This film should have gotten best makeup effects. Did you see the Mant? It was incredible. Visual effects. It was a shoo-in for these categories. I don't know what they were thinking with those digital dinosaurs in that park one. It's odd because the film also kind of walks that line between, yes, it's schmaltzy, but it's a film about films. It's a film about an era of Hollywood, and the Academy tends to like movies of that nature. You look at the Artist comes to mind immediately. They very much are okay with patting themselves on the back and saying, look, this is what we're capable of. However, it's a Universal production, and at the end of the day, Universal had two movies that they were going to put all of their Oscars in the basket, and that was Jurassic Park and Schindler's List. And Schindler was going to go for, we're going to push an award for all of the acting and the drama, the directing and the storytelling. And Jurassic Park was the sound and the thunder and the technical stuff. And they kind of did. I mean, they really cleaned up at the ceremony that year. And so a little feel-good movie from somebody by the name of Joe Dante was not going to be a blip on their radar in 1993. Had this film come out in a different year? Very possibly. I would not put it outside the realm of probability that it might get a writing or a directing nod.
I 100% agree. 93 was a very crowded year, and this film did arrive in a year dominated by very serious, prestige-oriented filmmaking. And I think that probably explains a lot about why it received no nominations. I think if we judge this film purely on craft and artistic merit, there are definitely categories where it could have been a legitimate contender. I mean, it was the kind of film the Academy historically, when it comes to this Schindler's List is the kind of film the Academy historically gravitates toward. It's a monumental historical drama, a moral statement, and a technically accomplished production. Against that backdrop, like you were saying, Sean, a warm, nostalgic, genre-focused film like Matinee was always going to face an uphill battle. But that does not mean it wasn't worthy. As Zan was saying, I would definitely have nominated for Best Original Screenplay, because it's the film's greatest achievement. It takes a very specific premise, a monster movie promotion during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and uses it to explore childhood, fear, entertainment, memory, and the way people cope with uncertainty. The writing has such a rare balance. It's funny without becoming a parody, it's sentimental without becoming sugary, and historically aware without becoming a lecture. A nomination alongside films like The Piano, The Remains of the Day, and Philadelphia would not have been out of place. Could it have won that category? Probably not. I mean, The Piano had the kind of artistic reputation the Academy often awards, and Schindler's List dominated the conversation, but I think a nomination would have been very defensible. Also, I would say Best Art Direction or Production Design. This is another category that I think it deserved attention because the film recreates early 1960s Key West with tremendous specificity. The theaters, the advertisements, the storefronts, the clothing, the military, the atmosphere, and the whole culture surrounding moviegoing. It doesn't just recreate a period, it recreates a feeling. I think the challenge is that the Academy often rewards production design that feels grand or visibly transformative. A film like Matinee uses design in a subtler way. It creates authenticity rather than spectacle, which is sometimes overlooked. Also, as you guys were alluding to, best costume design. I mean, the costumes are not flashy, but they're carefully period specific and help define the world. Again, the problem is that subtle historical accuracy often loses to more immediately impressive work. I would definitely have also thrown in Best Supporting Actor for John Goodman, because he gives the film its energy. He could have played Lawrence as this cartoonish carnival barker, but instead he finds the humanity underneath the performance. The character is funny and theatrical and intelligent and oddly touching. And I think John makes you believe in the importance of showmanship. However, 1993 had extremely strong performances, including a certain Tommy Lee Jones winning for The Fugitive and other acclaimed performances competing for attention. So John was probably a long shot, but not an absurd one. Now, why did the Academy overlook it? I have a few theories on this one. First off, Zan was mentioning this a lot throughout the course of this review. It was marketed as entertainment rather than prestige. And as we know, the Academy has often struggled to recognize films about pop culture, especially when they are funny or nostalgic. You know, a movie about a monster attraction and a theatrical gimmick does not immediately announce itself as important. Also, as you guys were saying, released in a very crowded year. Aside from Schindler's List, you have The Piano, The Remains of the Day, Philadelphia, The Fugitive, Jurassic Park, The Age of Innocence. A smaller, more intimate film can easily disappear. Also, I think its tone was difficult to categorize because the Academy often rewards films that fit clear boxes. Matinee is a coming-of-age story, it's a comedy, it's a historical film, it's a love letter to cinema, and a Cold War drama all at the same time. And I think that richness is part of its strength, but it may have been harder to campaign for. And also, of course, it celebrates B-movies. And as we know, there is a historical bias against genre entertainment. The film is literally about the value of something that many critics and awards voters might dismiss as disposable. The irony, I think, is that Matinee is very much about the exact thing the Academy often overlooks: the cultural importance of movies that bring people joy. Could it have won? I think a Best Original Screenplay win would have been the most plausible fantasy, though still unlikely against the prestige of The Piano or the overwhelmingly cultural force of Schindler's List. Also, as I said, a John Goodman nomination would also have been a wonderful recognition. But the biggest argument, I think, is that Matinee deserved to be remembered in the conversation. It's not a lesser film because it's about entertainment. It's a film about why entertainment matters, especially during frightening times. So in retrospect, I think its lack of recognition feels less like a failure of quality and more like an example of how awards bodies often overlook smaller films whose achievements are emotional, atmospheric, and quietly human rather than obviously monumental. So I guess those were just the breaks. So let's get to ratings then. Sean, you brought this movie. What do you give Matinee out of 10?
Excuse me, sorry. It would be easy for me to be flippant and say 10, and I would be completely justified in doing so. But I think I will go 9.5. Just to give it that it's a nearly perfect movie. There isn't anything to me that stands out as a nagging flaw. There is nothing that I would say that's totally wrong. You know, you can't do that or anything. And it definitely pushes all the right buttons. But I fear that sometimes in this industry, you lose a little bit of respect and prestige by saying, oh, that's great. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, that's wonderful. And everybody goes, yeah, but you also liked this. And so I've become a little more guarded. I've lost a little bit of my innocence. And it's my own fault because as they tell you, never read the comments.
Don't let the world break your gentle spirit, Sean.
I try very hard not to. But I've tried to look at things through, I hesitate to even say a critical eye, because there are films that I absolutely love that I will be the first person to admit, that one's kind of a dog, but I don't care. I love it. It's, it makes me happy and it's fun and it's this. And I don't know that I could say that with this one because it's a genuinely well-made movie. There's a lot of care and attention that goes into this on top of being enjoyable. So I don't necessarily feel like it's fair to dock points on one versus the other. So I've talked myself into it. It's a 10.
Totally fair and definitely makes sense. And of course, if it brings you joy, that's always a wonderful thing, of course. Zan, you celebrate things bringing people joy. What do you give this one out of 10?
Yeah, I give this one a 9 out of 10. It's not exactly a perfect movie, but it's as perfect as it's going to get for what it is. And I honestly don't think that high critical acclaim is what Lawrence Woolsey would have wanted in the first place. So I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable with my 9, but it's
bravo,
really
bravo.
Thank you. It's really a wonderful movie. It's a perfect mixture of of nostalgia and reality, and that nostalgia is, mostly rose-colored glasses. And it's wonderful performances, and like I said, it is extremely underrated, I think. But it's really wonderful. Yeah, it's a I don't give 10s very often, so I'm gonna stick with that. But it is definitely a 9 for me.
I am right there with you, Zan. I'm also going to give this a 9 out of 10. The reason why I wouldn't give it a perfect score is that it does have a few limitations. Some of the supporting characters are more lightly sketched than others, and the film occasionally does feel like it's juggling several ideas at once. The teenage subplots, the family drama, the Cold War anxiety, and the movie business satire don't always receive equal development. And also a few moments feel more like charming observations than fully explored story threads. But like you guys said, what it does brilliantly, it does better than most films. The biggest strength is, as we've been talking about throughout the course of this review, is the emotional intelligence. It could have been a simple nostalgia piece about old monster movies, but it understands that nostalgia is complicated. It doesn't look back at the early 60s and say, those were simpler times. Instead, it says, those were frightening times, and people found ways to create joy anyway. That distinction is what gives the film its lasting power. The screenplay is exceptional in how it connects two very different kinds of fear: the artificial fear created by movies and the genuine fear of nuclear destruction. The monster on the screen and the possibility of real-world catastrophe are placed side by side, and the film asks why humans are drawn to frightening stories when reality itself can be frightening enough. The answer I think it gives is surprisingly moving, because shared experiences help us face things that scare us. Also, the performances are another major reason for the 9 out of 10. John Goodman brings tremendous charm and complexity to the character of Lawrence, making him more than a flashy showman. He's funny, he's theatrical and slightly ridiculous, but also sincere. And he genuinely believes in the power of giving people a memorable experience. The younger cast also works well because the film treats adolescence seriously without making it overly dramatic. The atmosphere is probably my favorite aspect. The recreation of early 1960s America feels lived in rather than decorative. The movie theaters, once again, the advertisements, the military presence, the clothing, and social mood all contribute to the sense that you're watching not just a story, but a moment in time. Most importantly, this film understands something fundamental about cinema. Movies are communal experiences. The magic isn't only what's projected on the screen. It's in the audience sitting together, reacting together, and briefly sharing the same emotional space. And that idea feels even more meaningful now, when movie going has become more individualized. It isn't a flawless masterpiece in the way something like Schindler's List or The Piano might be described, but it's a beautifully crafted, deeply affectionate film that understands why we go to the movies in the first place. It's funny, it's thoughtful, it's warm, and it's quietly profound. And I think it deserved far more attention than it received, and its reputation has only improved as more people thankfully have recognized that it isn't really a film about monster movies. It's a film about how people use stories, imagination, and each other to get through scary times. And the gods know we need more of these movies. So let's see what our listeners made of this film. Getting to gold standard feedback this week, we have some from the wonderful Dave Proctor. So Zan, what does Mr. Proctor have for us this week?
Before I get into Dave Proctor, I will say that everything I just said, I'm giving Mant 10 out of 10 when it comes to parody and pastiche and homage. Mant, if you have the Shout Factory Blu-ray, Mant all put together in a little short film is there. You can find it on YouTube. It is one of the most brilliant parodies I've ever seen. I love it. So anyway, back to Dave. Dave says, "Hello, cinephiles. Nice one. This movie was very entertaining, and I like John Goodman in most things. He is very versatile and played this part convincingly. The rest of the cast did a fine job, but no one else really stood out particularly. The child actors carried their individual loads well enough, a challenge for sure. I really like the backdrop of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It adds to the plot in a nice way. I was aware of the fear of nukes and the horror industry capitalizing on it. This was a twist and a bit of a behind-the-scenes story. It is a simplified story for sure, but it kept the movie light and entertaining where it could have gotten preachy. Loved it. Keep them coming. Thank you, Dave. I love this one too."
Glad you enjoyed it, Dave.
Exactly. Glad you enjoyed it. Exactly. That's one of the great things about it. And so glad to hear from Dave, of course. So, of course, dear listeners, if you want to be like the wonderful Dave Proctor and share your thoughts on the films we discuss here, you can do so by shooting an email to goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Once again, goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Be sure to follow us on our social media. You can find us on X as Oscars Gold, Facebook as Gold Standard, the Oscars podcast, and of course, Blue Sky, where we're also at Oscars Gold. We love hearing from you guys and we appreciate the follow and the support. Also, if you'd like to hear us discuss your favorite movies, you can join our wonderful family of patrons on Patreon and check out what we have going on there. Of course, you also get to unlock our previous reviews of such films selected by our patrons, such as recently Godzilla -1, The Shawshank Redemption, Finding Neverland, Prey, and many more. So to join our Golden Army, head on over to patreon.com/goldstandardoscars. And a big thank you to our wonderful patrons for their support. Speaking of which, next month, as of this recording, our patrons have selected The Color Purple for us to review. Another happy-go-lucky uplifting movie, but a very important one nonetheless. That said, of course, regardless of the platform you're listening to this podcast on, be sure to rate and review us, as that keeps that algorithm stimulated. Believe you me, it needs a lot of stimulation because it allows our show to reach more like-minded ears like yours. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your mants. We don't care. Just spread the good word. Big thank you to those who have done so, and a future thank you to those who will. So, speaking of finding people and the fantastic things they do, Sean, when you're not here gracing us with your presence in the Gold Standard Theatre, where can folks find you on the interwebs?
Well, usually I am out and about fighting crime dressed as Batman, but when I'm not doing that, you can find me at flickswfriends.com, which is the main website for Flicks with Friends. We're also on Facebook, facebook.com/flickswfriends. And of course, like any amazing theater aficionado who just can't get enough, we are, of course, on Letterboxd. If you're not on Letterboxd, you need to be. And thank you to one of my patrons, Rick, who talked me into this silly thing because I spend entirely too much time on this site. If you're wanting to find us there once again, Flicks W Friends, just go to Letterboxd. It's LETTERBOXD.com.
Fantastic stuff. And speaking of folks who I know are on Letterboxd, Zan, where can folks find you?
You can find me with our friend Charles Skaggs on our podcast, Drunk Cinema, where we watch our favorite movies and over our favorite adult beverages and discuss them and record that discussion for your entertainment. I was watching this movie thinking, we should Drunk Cinema Matinee. Just another reason to watch Matinee, as I would think was what I was looking for. If you're looking for me on social media, your best bets would be Instagram, TikTok, or Letterboxd. And I just joined Tumblr, so we'll see how that goes. My handle on all of those is Udinax19.
Fabulous stuff indeed. And when it comes, of course, to our missing co-host, Rachel Friend, you can, of course, find her and her wonderful co-host on the Five-ish Fangirls podcast, where they do review any and every topic from the female perspective, geeky and nerdy, of course, because, as Rachel says, fangirls are real fans too. And of course, for more information about that, you can visit their website, the5ishfangirls.com, where you can also then connect with all their personal social media accounts as well. When it comes to myself, you can find me at my day job hosting the radio show Whiskey and Cigarettes, where we play the very best and nothing but the best of country music for you guys, from Alabama to Bailey Zimmerman. And for more information about that, you can visit our website, which is whiskeyandcigarettesshow.com. Podcast-wise, if you're fans of those superhero movies, you can find myself and Keith Bliss on Happiness in Darkness, the superhero movie podcast, where we do discuss any and every superhero movie under the sun. We recently reviewed the 1973 Spider-Man Strikes Back, of course, to get us in the mood for our next, of course, review, which will be Spider-Man Brand New Day. And last but certainly not least, myself and that Charles Skaggs guy will soon be returning to the Fandom Zone podcast, where we finish reviewing Spider-Noir. It's all about the spiders lately. Coming up next, we're going to be going to the DC world, and Charles will be driving the bus on that discussion, and it will be Lanterns. You get some Green Lantern action, and looking forward to that. And speaking of this to come on this show, next time as our wait for the 99th Best Picture to reveal itself continues. Speaking of aliens and fantastic places, we are going to be reviewing a film that Zan selected, and that film is the 1973 René Laloux film, Fantastic Planet, or La Planète Sauvage. So first off, Sean, thank you so much on behalf of myself, Zan, and Rachel for joining us today. It was a joy having you on. And of course, we look forward to having you back with us again with more of your movie selections.
As always, I appreciate the invite, and thank you so much for having me.
We certainly appreciate it, of course. So, Zan, Rachel's not here. Anything you would like to add on our upcoming movie or anything else before we sign off?
Well, Sean, definitely thank you for bringing this movie as well. Thanks for coming and thanks for bringing this movie. And just Fantastic Planet, just a reminder, kids, animation does not mean kids movie. So that's a just a reminder. This is not a boy, we'll have a discussion about what should have gotten a nod for best original score. I love the score of this picture. So I'm excited I'm excited to talk about it, and I'm looking forward to being able to have a reason to watch it again.
I am very excited to rewatch this. It has been a hot minute since I've seen it. Looking forward to revisiting it, of course. So I think it will make for a great discussion indeed. So, of course, dear listeners, thanks as always for listening to the show and supporting us. We will see you next time with Fantastic Planet and on Patreon with The Color Purple. Until then, big thank you once again to Sean Collins for joining us. And, of course, to Dave Proctor for writing in. Until then, enjoy those movies. Keep that popcorn hot. Big thanks to you all once again for the privilege of your time. Ciao, my people.